Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья.
Good evening, dear friends. Great pleasure to welcome you at the forum organized by AIJK organization. It's a 3-day forum, and I'd like to remind you that the culmination of our public program is this talk tonight, and then in the evening you're invited to the astronauts embankment, where you will see fireworks and the ceremonial turning on of the historical illumination of the bridge. Well, today we're happy to see you, the citizens of Saratov, at the talk with an outstanding person. Today, the outstanding person is a well-known American urbanist and architect, Джеф Спек. This is a unique chance to meet Jeff, and you'll have a chance to ask him questions during our talk. Jeff is a graduate of the Harvard University, and he's also the founder of a Social Design Institute. For a few years, Jeff was the leader of the Institute of Mayors to design the cities. This is a unique practice whereby during several years, the mayors of the real American cities are solving the daily problems. More than 150 mayors of the US cities have already been solving the city challenges together with Jeff. Jeff is also the leader of a movement called the New Urbanism, and many of us know him as an author of the Walkable City book. The theory of walkability is the main topic for tonight's talk. Jeff, I'd like to say that the very term walkable city, walkable, can be translated into Russian not as comfortable to walk, but also a city where the citizens choose to walk. So we're going to talk about what makes the citizens choose walking. I'd like to give the floor to Jeff, and after his presentation we'll have the Q&A session, and we'll be happy to welcome any questions from you. Jeff, the floor is yours, please.
This is a wonderful. So I speak fast, so I'm comfortable the translator will also speak fast. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to Strelka for bringing me here. It's my first time in Russia in my life. I am 7/8 Russian by heritage, so it's high time that I got here, and it's great to see Saratov as well as Moscow, and Dalia gave me a wonderful Moscow tour yesterday, although I don't think you can see too much in 6 hours, but we saw just about everything in Moscow in 6 hours. So I'm happy to be able to present to you today, and the talks I give are on the walkable city. I understand there's no proper translation for walkable in Russian, but what I mean by the walkable city, it's really it's the way we judge our cities. And it so happens what we've learned, what we urban designers in the US and now I think more globally have begun to learn, is that the best measure of the success of a city is actually how walkable it is. And by walkable we mean effectively that, let's just say, owning a car is optional. A lot of people still own cars, a lot of people still drive, but the idea that we used to do this, the idea that you build cities in which the car is necessary for every aspect of your daily life is an idea of the past. And now most American cities are working, and many European cities as well, are working to organize themselves, or really reorganize themselves, because they were originally this way, to reorganize themselves around walking and biking and transit, in which the ownership of the automobile is optional. So I give talks about why the walkable city is so important, and I give talks about how to do it. Now I only have a limited amount of time, and in fact we want to leave most of the time today for conversation. So I'm going to skip the Why We Need It talk, but I would direct you to TED.com. And at TED.com, and I believe it's translated into Russian, there's a 15-minute talk about why walkable cities are so useful, but I'm going to skip right into how to do the walkable city. And we start with this presumption. Maybe I need to convince you that walkable places are thriving places, but if that becomes a goal of yours, which it is most places I work, then the question is, how do you get people to walk? And that leads to what I call my general theory of walkability, which says essentially that, and it's the organizational principle of my book, Walkable City, but what it says is that in places, in driving places, and so much of the world is driving places, if you're going to get people to make the choice to walk, then the walk needs to be as good or better than the drive. And in order to do that, it has to do 4 things at once. The walk needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. And you have to do all 4. You can't just do 1 or 2. So that's the organizational structure of my work. It's the organizational structure of my book. It's the organizational structure of my talk to you today. We're going to go one by one through each of these. The reason to walk is the story of the history. It's based on the history of planning as a profession. Back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, as Blake called them. And the planners, who weren't yet called planners, said, hey, let's move the housing away from the factories. And when they did, lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes. And we like to say they've been trying to repeat that victory ever since. So you have the onset of this form of zoning in which the landscape is divided into large areas of single use. And for 50 years, this was what land design was about. Most land in America has a map like this on it that separates housing from office, from medical office, from shopping. And this guarantees that walking won't be useful because everything is so far away. Our most walkable places, you might recognize Manhattan in New York, our most walkable places, they're also organized by use, different uses, but it's like confetti. Is that a word? A thing? Confetti. Where every use is so small and they're all mixed so well together that walking gets you to most of your daily needs. So really what the study of older places teaches us is that there's only 2 tested ways to build community throughout the world and throughout history. And one is the traditional neighborhood. This is a typical New England neighborhood near where I live. And the other is suburban sprawl. And suburban sprawl, this is the American model. Your version is higher density. But the neighborhood is defined as being mixed use. And sprawl is defined as being large areas of single use. And in sprawl, there are places where you only live, nothing else, places where you only work, where you only shop, right? Places, and then when you separate, in America particularly, when you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with cars, then your highway system gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we tell people, you know, for many in America, this was the American dream, the little house on its own yard. But it's a 2-part dream. You can't have this without this. It's just how it works. Often to absurd extremes, the amount that we invest in our pavement so that we never have to wait more than 1 cycle at a light. And of course, driving isn't always that much fun, and being a pedestrian can be even worse. So these are the 2 models, and these drawings are the 2 most important things I'm going to show you in terms of the development of new places. On the left is the sprawl model. On the right is the neighborhood model. And it's important to understand it's the same stuff. But how big is it? And is it all mixed together? And then incidentally, do you have lots of little streets or fewer big streets? Because another aspect of making neighborhoods is having small blocks, and I'll talk about that. And that model is present in your older neighborhoods, in Saratov and throughout Russia. But when you're looking at a downtown of a city and you want to make it more walkable, the question is how well are the uses mixed? And forgive this being in English, but it's, you know, all the different uses, office, retail, dining, entertainment that you might find in a downtown. In most downtowns globally, housing is not in full representation. Housing, there's less housing than there should be to balance out the other uses. And one thing we do in most of the cities where we work is to try to bring more housing to the downtown so that you have that better balance. And when there's more housing in your downtown, everything else, the shops, the restaurants, the schools, everything gets better, much better in our city cores. Transit is the other part of the walk being useful. And we talked about this earlier, is that you can have a perfectly walkable neighborhood without transit. But a walkable city relies on transit because if the different walkable parts of the city if you can't get from one to the other without a car, then everyone buys cars and your city becomes a driving city. What we see here is the sheer efficiency. One L train in Manhattan carries as many people as 2,000 cars. And every bus carries as many people as more than 100 cars. So you can see the sheer efficiency. We know that mobility translates into wealth. The more efficiently you can provide mobility, the wealthier a society you will have. And of course, the last part of transit that I enjoyed talking about, and this exists now in Moscow, is these bike share programs, which are happening all over the world. People sometimes don't want to subsidize, is that a word, subsidize? The governments sometimes don't want to support bike share. But when you think of it as a piece of the transit system, it's much easier to get it funded. That's the useful walk. The safe walk is the biggest category. It's the one that cities can effect most quickly in the shortest amount of time. And it all has to do, in the US we used to talk about the safe walk, it had to do with crime. But now in most of our cities, crime isn't the real threat. Statistically speaking, the real threat is getting hit by a car. And this is in miles per hour, forgive me. But what you really need to know is that a car going 55 kilometers per hour is 9 times as likely to kill you as a car going 30 kilometers an hour. So anything you can do that encourages cars to go more slowly is positive. And so everything else I'm going to show you is all about creating an environment in which cars are more likely to go slowly. The first is small blocks. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks or 60-meter blocks. This is Salt Lake City, famously unwalkable, famously 200-meter blocks. This is my family. They give you flags to raise when you cross the street so you won't be hit by a car. Because a big block city, here's Portland on the left and Salt Lake City on the right. A 200-foot block city can be a 2-lane city. A 600-foot block city is mostly a 6-lane city. Fatter roads. And road width, of course, is the next issue. The more lanes there are, the faster the cars go, the more it feels like a highway, the longer it takes to cross. And many streets have lanes that are wider than they have more lanes than they need. This is Oklahoma City where I worked, and all the streets they didn't have enough traffic to support the number of lanes. But the biggest, the two biggest conversations in almost every city that one works in as a city planner are traffic congestion and parking. I'm not going to talk about parking tonight because I don't have time unless you ask me. But the one huge lesson we've learned about traffic congestion in the US that's really important is that you cannot solve congestion by adding lanes. This is ideal traffic planning. The yellow line is the number of cars. The purple is the capacity of the road. When the number of cars exceeds the capacity of the road, you get congestion. And traffic engineering theory says that when you widen the road, you absorb the anticipated trips and the congestion will go away. Unfortunately, that never happens. What we've learned time after time after time is that when you widen the street, add more lanes, add a new highway, that more cars come and it fills up almost immediately. And the experience is that within 4 years, all new capacity that you provide has attracted new cars. Why? Because the principal constraint to driving is congestion. Traffic is the main reason why people choose not to drive. So when you reduce traffic, you invite more people to drive. And you can't, the expression is, adding lanes to fight congestion is like loosening your belt to fight obesity. So, here's the study It was presented to the Paris School of Economics. I have no idea what this means, but I do know what the conclusion means, which is that time after time, whenever you add lanes to congested systems, they don't become less congested. So it's important as you move forward to understand that. Because in America, we make the highways wider and wider and wider, and we still have too many cars on them. Next is the width of the lanes. The typical local street in America is now wide enough to allow you to observe the curvature of the earth. And the standards have shifted. So this is a subdivision this is a neighborhood from the 1960s, and here's one from the 1980s. And look how the roads got wider. Just the standards, the engineering standards changed. My old neighborhood in Miami Beach wasn't draining properly, so they had to rebuild the curb. And when they did it, they took away half our sidewalk, and they took away our trees. Why? Because the engineers had a new standard that bore no relationship to what was needed. The wider a street gets, the faster cars go. The wider a street gets, the more risk of injury. A 4-meter lane, a 4-meter driving lane, has 10 times the severity of impact as a 3-meter driving lane. And a 3-meter lane, at least in the US now, a 3-meter lane is the new standard. I know in Moscow they're fighting for 3.25 meters, but we're fighting for 3 meters and we're getting it. This is the US's engineering organization, the National Association of City Transportation Engineers, and they're putting in a 10-foot, that's a 3-meter lane width. It's important. We have too many signals in the US. Signals are not as safe. This is art. This is not a real place. But signals are not as safe as stop signs. What we found is that when you replace an unnecessary signal, a signal that you don't need, with an always stop sign, or just a naked intersection, an intersection with no signs at all, you reduce the number of injuries by 2/3. So reducing the number of signals also matters. And then bicycling, which I'm sure you're tired of hearing. Everyone's tired of hearing about bikes, but bicycling, if you're a planner, bicycling is the biggest revolution currently underway in only some global cities. This is Portland, Oregon, which is probably America's best biking city. And Portland, Oregon invested $60 million in biking over 25 years. I heard that Oslo is about to invest $500 million. I think London's investing about $1 billion in biking. But Portland has a ton of biking because they made that investment. And I asked my friend from Portland to send me some pictures, and I said, was this Bike to Work Day? You know, we have this thing in the US called Bike to Work Day. And he said, no, this is just Tuesday in Portland. But what we find is the bicycling follows the biking investment. If you don't invest in bike lanes, you don't get bicyclists. This is the new standard, and this is something that many cities are instituting now in the US and Canada. In Europe, it's the protected bike lane. Notice how the parked cars have been pulled off the curb, and the bike lane is protected by the parked cars. This is after they painted it green. And then this one in New York City, you notice they turned a 3-laner into a 2-laner by pulling the parked cars off the curb. They protected the bikes. The number of cyclists went up 3 times. Speeding went from almost all drivers to a smaller percentage of drivers. Crashes went down 63%. And interestingly, the road carries as many cars now as it did before. So there's no one suffers. The drivers don't have to suffer by being able to drive less. You need to protect, this says give cyclists space, but it's taking the cycle space. But you need to protect the lane or stuff goes in it. In the US, it's mostly delivery trucks that take up the bike lanes. This says Denver tech companies, the #1 thing they want is bike lanes. Employers wanting to attract talented workers demand cities, at least in the US, to build more bike lanes. Parallel parking is a barrier of steel. This curb parking, it's a barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. This is what we call happy hour, right? After work, you get a drink. This is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. On the left, you're allowed to park. On the right, you're not. On the left side, people are having fun. On the right side, no one's having fun. Without the parked cars, the sidewalk does not feel safe. Street trees are another important part of this discussion. Street trees slow cars down, sometimes abruptly, but better a car hits a tree than a person. This is what a sidewalk feels like when it doesn't have parked cars or street trees, right? And then there's all this new development around making colorful crosswalks, and they finally changed the rules so that cities and citizens are allowed to, this one slows the cars down a lot. This is in India. But cities and citizens are now allowed to do more colorful crosswalks, which matters too. So we're almost done. The safe walk is the biggest one. The last two categories are quick. The comfortable walk is a little bit, do you have a word, counterintuitive? It's a little bit counterintuitive. All animals, humans among them, we all seek, the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals seek prospect and refuge. Prospect is seeing your predators, and refuge means that your flanks feel covered from attack. And if your flanks don't feel covered, you don't feel comfortable. So the best public spaces have firm edges, good, solid, tall edges. And a plaza is only as good as its walls. We've been talking about this for many years. You know, what's the best ratio? 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 6-to-1. In Salzburg, can be very delightful. And we say in the U.S. the opposite of Salzburg is Houston. And in Houston, you have all these, it's much better now, this is an old picture, but the surface parking lot is the principal thing that makes walking so uncomfortable. And then finally, the interesting walk, 1-to-1, the 1-to-1 ratio was considered the Renaissance ideal. And some of your best streets here are 1-to-1. This is a 1-to-1 ratio, but no one wants to walk on this street. Right? Because when one side is an exposed parking structure and the other side is actually a hotel that was designed in admiration for the parking structure, it's just boring. No one wants to walk and be bored. So we've learned in the US, and I've seen some examples over here where it only takes 20 feet of building to hide, it only takes 10 meters of building to hide 100 meters of parking garage. You want to put it behind something and hide it from the sidewalk. And then finally, public art. Some places are just going to be boring because they're blank walls. And it's too late, the blank wall is there, what do you do? That's where I like to see the art budget spent. This is how we do it in the US, this is how they do it in Europe. But keep it clean, take care of it, it's very important. So, that's it, those are the 4 categories. But the point is that you need to do all 4 of those things, and if you don't, people will choose to drive. And so when we try to make a place better, we use this concept, this organization, in order to figure out what work needs to be done. I want to direct you to a few resources. My book, Walkable City, which is translated into into Russian, not German. A few other languages, not German. These are the other 2 books I worked on with my mentors, Suburban Nation, very much about how America grew up around the automobile, and the Smart Growth Manual, which has to do with larger scale decisions, regional scale decisions about how to grow. And then there's the TED Talk I showed you, but believe it or not, there's another TED Talk, which is kind of this talk. So if you want to hear this talk translated into Russian, I believe that's also at TED. If you go to TED.com and look up my name, which is SPECK, you'll find these talks. And then I'm on Twitter. Some people have already tweeted at me here, and I've retweeted them. But I'm Jef Spek. I don't know if it works in Cyrillic, but my Twitter handle is Jef Spek AICP. And that's it, I think. So now I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chef. Сейчас у нас будет пара вопросов, и для того, чтобы...
We'll now have a couple of questions, and just to make our talk fun, I would like to ask a burning question. To what extent is the theory of a walkable city applicable to the cities like Saratov? Do you think it's applicable, or there are some restrictions? And the second question, to what extent is the US government sharing your theory, or do you think it's pretty new and you have to convince your opponents?
So the first one was whether this is applicable
Whether it's a
to...
universal one.
I do believe that these principles are universal, but different countries are in different stages of adopting them. So, for example, I was asked by Ted to give a talk in London in a couple months, and I said, no, I mean, London has nothing to learn from me, because London's doing it already. I think Europe is very much ahead of the US, and then other parts of the world, I think, are behind the US. But I think the principles are universal, even, and this is what a lot of people are concerned about, even in bad weather. People often say, well, it's snowy here, or it's rainy here, or it's too cold, it's too hot. And I remind them that like two of the best cities for tourism, for walking around in North America, one is Quebec City in Canada, and the other is New Orleans in Louisiana, are horribly cold and horribly hot. And actually what happens when you build proper streets, particularly that are comfortable, that are well-shaped, that impacts the climactic conditions and makes it much more comfortable to walk around. Particularly trees have a tremendous impact on heat islands. You had a heat wave in Moscow, I guess in Russia, but it was maybe 4 years ago, and thousands of people died. And you know, you read that news, and then you learn that a good urban canopy, a good continuous planting of trees in the city reduces overall city temperatures by about 10, I would say, 4 degrees Celsius. That's impactful. That saves lives. Now, the second question was.
Насколько все-таки эти теории...
Can you hear the interpreter, Jeff? To what extent is your theory of walkable city applicable to Saratov?
I think it's the wrong ear. Not sure which side. Okay.
Shall I repeat the question? Exactly.
I believe it's entirely applicable to Saratov. The question is, and there's a smaller talk tomorrow where I'll be addressing this. Saratov, remarkably like most American cities, Saratov has a inner city which is organized according to much more traditional urban principles, and it has a periphery which is organized much more according to autocentric sprawl principles. And the challenges are much greater in the outer area. This is a little bit of a difficult discussion to have, but there are certain parts of Saratov that will never be walkable. But the good news is that most cities that even in the US that have a reputation for great walkability, most of those cities geographically are not walkable. What really matters is that you have a core, a downtown, which offers the walkable lifestyle to those people who want it. And then ideally, and this is why transit is so important, if you're living in a place or even working in a place that is built according to is built around the automobile and is very difficult to fix, if you can have a transit connection to the urban walkable core, then that lifestyle is available to you without having to drive into the city.
Джефф, скажите, пожалуйста, какие...
Jeff, please tell me, what are the cities in the world, the most progressive ones in terms of walkability, and how can the walkability be measured? I know the developed street life and comfort for pedestrians are the measurements, but what other measurements can be there?
So we actually has anyone here heard of Walk Score? It's a website. It's got a lot of places in the world. It may not have Russia, but there's actually, and I should say the algorithm is flawed. Like, it's not a perfect test. But there's this website and model called Walk Score, and it actually rates every single neighborhood, every single city, every single street, every single address in America and in other countries in terms of how walkable it is. It bases the measurement principally on what you have access to. How many things are in your neighborhood that are useful to walk to. And that's not a particularly good way to measure it. I mean, that's not what walkability is alone. That's only the useful walk. It so happens, though, that it turns out to be a good measure because those places that are mixed use also tend to be those places that were designed before before World War II, and therefore have all the other details that make places walkable. So it is possible to measure that. What was the first part of your question again? Do you remember?
Which cities are famous?
Oh, so the real stars, the best stars, I think, are in Europe. Copenhagen probably wins, just because of the tremendous amount of biking that happens in Copenhagen. 6 times as many people bike to work or school in Copenhagen than drive to to work or school, and that's mind-blowing. What's most interesting is when you look at the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands, and you say, oh, I can't do that. Well, as recently, and maybe it doesn't seem recent to you, but I'm a little old, and I remember the 70s very well. As recently as the 70s, these countries did not look so different from the rest of the world. They didn't look very different. Like the Netherlands in the 70s and the US in the 70s did not look all that different. But the US made the decision to keep investing in cars, and the Netherlands, probably because we make so many cars and our economy is so car dependent, the Netherlands made the decision to instead invest in bicycle infrastructure, and now the countries seem just so different from each other when once they were quite similar. It's amazing to me the degree to which decisions about mobility decisions about how to move around are simply a function of how the government chooses to invest. And by the way, all forms of transportation need to be supported by the government. What I mean by that is that, highways aren't free, right? The cities and the states build the highways. They're not free. In the same way, transit isn't free, and you shouldn't expect to make a profit on a transit system. You don't make a profit when you build a highway. But often there's this confusion that transit costs more to provide than roads, when in fact per trip it doesn't.
Спасибо, Джефф. А сейчас хотелось бы спросить немного.
Thank you, Jeff. I'd like to ask a provocative question now. In many Russian cities today, we are facing big changes. There is public realm that might change, and we are today in Saratov, which is a pilot project, and today we saw in the area around the train station there was a pilot refurbishment. From your practice, these moments when there is a need to change something, how well is it perceived by the local population, and is there any future for such changes?
So, first of all, I was very impressed by the exercise I saw at the square by the train station that Strelka's doing, and also with some of the street changes that they're making in Moscow. They're actually very similar to the work that we're doing in the U.S., and I actually feel like you're doing more than me. But I'm just one person and you're hundreds of people, so maybe that's okay. But the experience we have in most American cities, in every city, I mean, and I've been doing this for 20, 25 years, is that there is always more vocal opposition to change than there is support for change. Doesn't matter whether the change is good or bad. Of course, we hope all the changes we do are good, but hearing the public reaction is actually not a good indicator. This sounds bad, but hearing the public reaction is actually never a good indicator of whether the change is good or not, because the public is always against everything. Now, why is that? Well, unhappy people are louder than happy people. Usually at a public hearing or at any forum in which change is being suggested, at least in the US, the only people who show up are the people who are personally affected by that change in a negative way. And it's important to acknowledge when you make changes that benefit the greatest majority, there are always minorities of people. There's always a limited number of people who will suffer. And sometimes when people come to a hearing, a public hearing, and they stand up and they say, I don't want you to do this project because it will ruin the view from my yard. You know, this project, let's say the city needs a parking structure, and building the parking structure will block the view from my yard. The proper answer isn't to ignore them and say you're wrong. It's to say, actually, sir, you're right. This project is going to make your house worse. But it's going to benefit everybody else, and maybe you should fight it, but it's the job of our municipal officials, it's the job of our government leaders to make the decision that will make the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. And at least in the US, the people who benefit tend not to show up at the hearing. It's only the people who are going to suffer. And so it's always difficult. That's why we need real leaders in government who think about the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Джефф, у нас сегодня уникальный формат, когда здесь сидят горожане, и вот скажите, из вашего опыта, какая вообще роль горожанина в этих изменениях, как лучше их привлекать к этому процессу изменений, и в целом...
I'm not hearing any translation, I'm sorry.
What is, can you hear it now? Yes. So what is the role of citizens, how to involve the citizens in these changes? And you also have a very rich experience of interacting with mayors of the cities. I have already mentioned in introducing you that over 150 mayors were trying to solve their challenges together with you during the workshops. So what do you think should the role of the mayors be, and the citizens, what should be their role to make everybody happy?
So, having complained perhaps about the performance of citizens related to projects I've worked on, I should put that in context and say our strategy for making plans in the US, it's inevitable because the citizens have become so vocal and powerful, is that we involve citizens in planning from the very beginning. We have them there when we do the sketch plans, we have them there when we present alternatives, we design, it's called a planning charrette, that's the term, it's a French word, charrette. It's an architectural term that means working really hard for a long period of time. But we design in these public workshops that totally expose the work to the public, and we invite participation at every level. And I've got to say that I spoke somewhat pessimistically about the way that people react to design, but many of the projects that I work on, for example, to make city streets safer, and to make cars go a little bit more slowly, and to make sidewalks feel more protected. A lot of these projects have a very large public behind them, and they are very helpful and engaged as you move forward with them. In terms of the mayors, I think I've already said that mayors and governors need to understand that their leadership is needed in helping to put forward these decisions. But I think the reason that my organization, when I was at I used to work at the National Endowment for the Arts, which is the United States Arts Council, and part of the federal government. The reason that we founded the Mayor's Institute on City Design was because one particular mayor, Joseph Riley, who was mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, for 40 years, he woke up one morning and he kind of pounded his forehead and said, "Oh my gosh, I just realized that I'm the principal urban designer of my city. I'm making decisions every day that have impact on the quality of the public realm of my city, and I'm not sure if I'm doing a good job or not. And I'd like to get together with some architects and urban designers and really learn how to do urban design." So these Mayors Institutes, each one was 8 mayors, 8 designers, not just architects, but city planners, landscape architects, engineers, traffic engineers, maybe other mayors who had done great things in their city. Each of these workshops was 8 mayors and 8 professionals. And each mayor would bring a case study. What's the largest urban design challenge facing my city? And because it was such a small group and private, and by the way, no media, no citizens, closed door, absolutely private. It's like Las Vegas. What happens at the Mayor's Institute stays at the Mayor's Institute. And we would do a little workshop on each of the mayor's challenges. Now, sometimes we would help solve the problem, but the real hidden purpose of the Institute was to teach mayors to be better urban designers, or at least better clients of urban design. And there was also there was a double hidden intention, which is to turn the mayors into design fans, to turn the mayors into people who love design. And it didn't always happen, but there were always a certain number of mayors who would go home after these workshops and say, I'm going to be a design mayor. I'm going to be a mayor who cares about public spaces. And it's funny, you know, Mayor Riley would tell the mayors, in Mayor to Mayor, I think that's very useful, he would tell the mayors, look, when you're dead and gone, no one's going to remember if you balance the budget. You know, no one's going to remember all this political stuff you're doing. But if you build a park, you'll be remembered forever.
Так, а теперь хочется, поскольку это беседа с знаменитым человеком, наконец дать вам уникальный...
And now, I'd like to share the joy of talking to an outstanding person with you and give you an opportunity to ask questions.
I have a question for you. My first question is, do you collaborate with Fitbit or Apple Incorporated for creation any motivation for patient or people in the city?
Maybe we should ask the questions are asked in Russian and then everyone can understand them, and then I'll get the translation. Can you say that in Russian?
Можно, пожалуйста, попросить всех все вопросы из зала дублировать, говорить на русском, чтобы переводчик смог переводить, так будет просто быстрее.
Mr. Spek, do you collaborate with Fitbit or Apple corporations to develop a certain motivation among people to urge them to walk more?
Okay. You know, Fitbit is a very big deal in the U.S., probably like it is here. And I've been amazed, even observing my own wife, at how effective it is. I do like to distinguish what I do from motivating people to walk, because my belief is that it's very hard to change human behavior, except environmentally. So there's a whole segment of the population of city planners who try to create programs to incentivize, to get people excited about living healthier lifestyles, but I don't have such a rosy impression of human nature, and I believe that unless you improve the actual environment for walking, ultimately they'll go back to their cars.
As for me, as a vascular surgeon, it's really the same story. Извините. И второй вопрос.
Yes, and my second question, what is your attitude to the idea of Elon Musk to dig a lot of tunnels under LA?
You know, Elon Musk is a really smart guy who's really stupid about a few things. And I'll wait for the translation. He has, I mean, anyone I know who understands anything about transportation planning thinks his tunnel idea is absolutely flawed from a geometric perspective. It's also rather elitist. It's essentially giving the wealthy more choices and not expanding choice for everyone else. But I like his solar panel batteries and his car.
I can't ask you. I'm an American.
Someone translate the American question.
I've been here for 3.5 years and been coming to Saratov since 2002.
You're not just American, you're Texan.
Yes. Actually
Nice.
from Arizona, but
Okay.
I've been living in Dallas for a long time. I worked with TxDOT as an engineer. I did DART light rail design, but one of the designs I got to work on was Katy Trail and some of the other hike and bike trails.
Yes.
And but you didn't mention anything about the converting old rail lines to walking areas?
So this was a short talk, and I couldn't address everything. The questioner mentioned working with TxDOT, which is the Texas Department of Transportation. Most departments of transportation in the U.S. are very old-fashioned, and they understand their role as just building highways and nothing else. But in Texas, there's been a lot of great rails to trails effort, which means an old rail bed, an old railway, which is no longer used, is turned into a biking and walking trail. And just for your pleasure, questioner, I was just last month biking around Houston on one of these new trails. I think that for the challenge with biking and adding biking facilities to cities is until you have a system which is useful, people still won't bike. So you can invest a lot of money in bike lanes, but if they don't connect properly and if they don't get you to most places in the city, you won't really have the biking population. And so you actually have to make a pretty big initial investment before you see returns. And it can be frustrating because you have to wait until the system is somewhat comprehensive. Often in cities people say, oh, we can't invest in biking because no one bikes here. And the answer to that is, that's like saying we can't build that bridge because no one's walking across the river. Your other question?
I like your ideas on with bike parking and your improving pedestrian. I did work at TxDOT for 3 years, but I wasn't a typical engineer for them. I was more mass transit and into a lot of the stuff that you are.
I'm sure it was frustrating for you. But,
it was fun. You learn.
But you know, everything I've learned about traffic engineering, which I use to combat traffic engineers, I learned from traffic engineers. There's a certain number. It's limited, but it's growing, at least in the US. There's a certain, and I found, at least in Europe, they're much more progressive. But there's a certain limited number of traffic engineers who are trying to reform the profession, and slowly they're getting there.
Здесь вопросы в этой части есть? Вот опять вы.
Здравствуйте, спасибо за...
Hello, thank you very much for your lecture. America, the US, is a relatively young country. Can you tell us about your experience in the European countries with the historical centers involved, where it's very difficult to introduce some changes? And the second question, sorry for my ignorance, but what is your professional background?
Okay. So, you know, the difference between our country, our cities and yours, is that for us, something that's 200 years old is as important to us as something that's 500 years old is to you. In other words, because our country isn't that old, the stuff that's a little bit old feels really old, and so it presents the same conditions to us that your older city centers present to you. The good news is that most of the work that needs to be done to make our city centers, our traditional city centers, more walkable, is bringing them back to closer to their original condition. And as a great example, I know you don't all go to New York, but if you know an American city, it's probably New York. Park Avenue in New York used to have a park in the middle. You know, now it's got this skinny little median, this skinny little green in the middle, because first it was 2 lanes on each side of this park. Then it was 3 lanes on each side of a narrower park. Then it was 4 lanes on each side of a narrower park. And that's how it stopped being Park Avenue. But restoring our streets to the way they used to be, always, because we didn't used to drive, always makes them more walkable. But it's important because I almost never talk about historic preservation, the preservation of older buildings. It's really important to stress that having another aspect of the interesting walk is for places to have character. And in America, at least, every city is now looking more and more alike because we have the same chain restaurants, the same repetitive architecture. Every McDonald's looks like every other McDonald's. And so preserving historic buildings is a key part of making places interesting. because they're different from each other, right? My professional background is that after going to liberal arts college, I was an investment banker for 2 years. I apologize. Then I studied architectural history in Florence, Italy for 2 years. Then I went to architecture school for 4 more years at Harvard University. And in 1993, when I was 30, I had my first real job, because I don't count banking. I had my first real job, and you know, I basically made the people I most admired in the world hire me. So I showed up on the doorstep of the husband and wife team, Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who invented this thing that's called the New Urbanism. And the New Urbanism is the movement now that a couple thousand people belong to around the world. And the New Urbanism is about reintegrating cities, refocusing growth towards city centers and not towards the suburbs, and then supporting traditional urban organization of cities as opposed to automotive orientation. And that whole movement in the US began in around 1980 with this husband and wife team, Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and I basically made them hire me, and I worked for them for 10 years, and I mean, half my slides are still from them.
Добрый вечер. Спасибо за беседу.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your lecture. My question is, people are mostly selfish, and the comfort of their drive is more important for them than the comfort of the people around them. What do you think about the idea of showing passive resistance, not to make the roads wider, but to make the pavements wider, and to allocate most of the lane to the bicyclists, and then it would be faster to walk than to drive. The passive resistance, huh?
So people are selfish, but I think it's that's a political question. It's not a design question, it's a political question. It's about, is there a word for hegemony? It's about who has the power. And in every city there's a constant, I think, tension between the drivers and the walkers. One thing they teach us is about what kind of language to use when you're writing a planning report. And one thing they say, for example, is don't say drivers, bicyclists, pedestrians. Say people driving, people biking, and people walking, because it's all the same people. And if you think about it, you probably at different times of day are one of these people. Right? The same people can sometimes bike, sometimes walk, sometimes drive. So that's important. But I think it's very, very interesting and useful to think about, in terms of selfishness, think about how you behave as a driver versus how you behave as a pedestrian. When you're a driver, you're no longer a citizen, you're a motorist, right? You're a driver. Every other person on the road is one of only 2 things to you. They're either an impediment, right, an obstruction, or they're a risk to your life. They're a deadly danger. And you kick into this kind of pre-modern, primordial brain set where you're fighting for space and you're fighting for survival. And that's why drivers are such jerks. Now, I've never gotten the finger. Is that an expression? Can you say that? No one's ever given me a rude hand gesture, and I won't demonstrate. No one's ever given me a rude hand gesture while we were walking, but plenty of times while we were driving. And so I think that's really important to think about as you try to evolve a healthy society. In terms of allocation of space, there's a more practical answer to your question, which is not so often am I rebuilding or telling cities to rebuild streets. Normally we're restriping the streets. We're reconfiguring the markings on the pavement. It's very expensive to move curbs. It's very expensive to reshape the drainage of the street and the construction of the street. But you can get an incredible amount done simply by what we say, you lay on a new top coat of asphalt, right? Do you call it asphalt, of pavement? And then you make the driving lanes a little bit narrower, or maybe you take away one driving lane and make a protected bike lane, as I've showed you. You can even take a parking space and put a wood deck in it, it's called a parklet, and expand the sidewalk without paying for a whole new, stone or concrete sidewalk. So we make smaller, almost tactical interventions, mostly with paint. And it's much easier to actually get cities to agree to fund it if you do it more with paint than with construction. But how far to go, how much to take from the car and give to the bike, it's often it's a very fraught political conversation.
Дорогие друзья, мы вынуждены.
Dear friends, we have to finish by now. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And can we ask the very last question? Please choose the one to ask the very last question. The three last questions, huh? Okay, the last three questions. Good evening, Jeff. Thank you so much for your lecture. My question is, in the US and in Russia, at present, there is a more or less similar situation with the underdeveloped public transport. There is a pendulum of migration that you were showing, the flows, morning, evening, traffic flows. What do you think? Where can we take the budget from to replace the rolling stock, to create the network of high-speed trams? Where to take the funding from in the cities to build it all?
It's difficult for me to answer that question not knowing how your cities work. But in the U.S., okay, in the U.S., the state departments of transportation have their own huge bundles of money that's not touched. And not only our highways that connect our cities, but many main streets, many high streets, shopping streets in our cities are actually state roads. And the state department of transportation have this budget that's huge, that's unquestioned, and they're always widening and widening and widening. Meanwhile, transit is often in a bag with everything else, and it has to fight everything else in order to be improved. Washington, D.C.'s metro, the wonderful subway system in Washington, D.C., has had deadly crashes, fires, deadly fires, all these problems in the last few years. And everyone says the same thing. Unlike other metro systems in the U.S., it lacks a dedicated funding source. So at least in my experience, if you believe in transit, it's important to establish an ongoing source of funding from all the institutions, mostly cities that benefit from the presence of the rail line, that is not in the same bag as anything else.
Jeff, а раз уж мы спросили сейчас про общественный транспорт, сегодня просто мы с Джеффом тоже прогуливаясь по Саратову.
When Jeff and I were walking around Saratov, we observed that there are different types of public transport, including tram here in Saratov. And you have already mentioned the remark on the identity it bears and the economic effects of the public transport. So what can be the economic effects of it?
I can't speak to that with much precision, but the interesting thing about, if you compare our countries, is that you kind of hit the auto age in the 90s, in the 1990s. What you experienced in the 1990s is kind of what the U.S. experienced in the 20s, where it was very easy for a normal working person to get a car. And until then, you didn't have that experience. Now, I can't imagine what it must feel like to be a Russian now, and to be someone who, especially if you're older like me, who has gone from not having the ability to own a car to all of a sudden you can own a car. And I imagine if you're like America, much of your status and your self-image is tied up in what kind of car you own. And in fact, the car you own, you half own it to get around, and you half own it as kind of a representative of your person. And so in the US, we actually, this is kind of pessimistic, but in the US we went through, 60, 70 years of that. Until if you talk to the younger people now, the millennials, the people in their 20s and 30s, that's now no longer the case. But it took a long time. When I was young, 1 out of 12 19-year-olds chose not to get a driver's license. Now, 1 out of 4 19-year-olds choose not to get a driver's license, which is astounding to people my age to think that that's happening. But driving is no longer cool in the US. What's cool is cycling and riding transit and living in the inner city where actually a car is more of a nuisance than a benefit. And so I think the biggest challenge that Russians face is that you're still in this period of giddy excitement over owning cars, and you haven't realized that we, in America, every city in America with more than 10,000 people in it had a tram system. And I imagine Europe is very similar. And many smaller cities, but every single city, if you had more than 10,000 people in it, you had trams, trolleys in your street. Almost every city ripped them out. And we all regret it so badly. And we're rebuilding our trams at great expense to make our cities more lively when we once had them and we got rid of them. And I don't know if you've ever heard the story, but it was actually a conspiracy that General Motors and Standard Oil and the tire company and all the other folks who made cars and made roads, the asphalt companies, the road builders, they bought up the train systems and ripped them out in order to sell more cars. And they were actually found guilty of criminal conspiracy and fined $5 in court. Because the damage was done, there was no point in asking for any money. I had a really eye-opening experience about a year ago. I went to Melbourne. Has anyone been to Melbourne? Melbourne is like one of the only Western-style cities outside of Europe. So it feels like America to me, but because Australia and America are very similar. It's one of the only Western-style cities outside of Europe where they never got rid of their trams. And what's amazing about Melbourne, we struggle in American cities to have non-chain store retail, to have shops and restaurants that aren't McDonald's and big national boring chains, or they're the same absolutely everywhere. And when you find a main street where every shop is different and it's all individual store owners and all the money is being made locally and not being sent to some multinational corporation, that's the kind of main street that you want to have. And in Melbourne, different from even Sydney, in Melbourne, around every prospect, every main street has a tram down the middle, and every main street has hundreds, kilometer after kilometer of unique non-chain stores, unique local stores. And I'm sure, because I travel a lot and I look around, I'm sure that one is the function of the other. That having so much great local retail is a function of having still the trams in the streets. And I know it's not much admired, but I would just behoove you, I would, that's not the word, translator, I would beseech you, I would ask you deeply from my heart to not tear out your tram, because you'll regret it later.
Последний вопрос вот здесь, и на этом закончим.
And the very last question from here. Good evening. My question is, this year is announced as the year of ecology in Russia. And the topic of our event is the environment for life, with a healthy focus, obviously. My question is, to what extent is it beneficial for the cities to make people walk as different to treating them afterwards and using the healthcare system for that? Do you have any economic calculations to support this evidence that walking is healthier and cheaper for the government than to treat these people afterwards, to avoid building hospitals and medical centers? Thank you.
The question answers itself. However, I'm happy to answer it myself. this is a topic I didn't really cover here today. It's part of the why walkability, why is walking so important talk, and it's in the TED Talk that I directed you to. It's even more in my book, which, did I mention, is translated into Russian. But there's tremendous data, and actually there's economic data and there's health data. There's an incredible book written in English called Urban Sprawl and Public Health, written by two epidemiologists, is that a word? Two epidemiologists and a planner, that documents how expensive it is to have a driving population, and documents how the American healthcare crisis, which is, I'm sure, not so different than Russia, but the American healthcare crisis is actually a walking crisis, that we've because so few Americans are walking anywhere anymore, we're not fit. We're just out of shape, and it causes us to get all these other diseases and to get diabetes and to die early. And you know, we have the first generation of Americans right now who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents. And it's a function of the fact that no one's walking anywhere anymore. But the economic data is also very clear. I saw one calculation that, at least for the US, showed that when someone pays $1 to bike, it costs society about 8 cents. And that's paying for the bike lanes. And when you have a biking system, for every $1 someone pays to bike, and if you think about it, bikes are not, it's not expensive, but for every $1 someone pays to bike, society has to pay 8 cents. For every $1 someone pays to walk, I guess that's the price of your sneakers, but for every $1 someone pays to walk, society has to pay about 2 cents for sidewalks and other accommodations. For every $1 Americans pay to drive, society has to pay about $9. And that's for the construction of the roads, the policing of the roads, the ambulances on the roads, the cost of the pollution and the time wasted. And I think transit, for every $1 that you pay for transit, society pays, I think, 50 cents. So in all of those, it's a net benefit to the society, except for driving, where there's tremendous costs. And then if you calculate in climate change, which, you know, you're not so far above your river here. If you calculate in climate change, then walkability becomes super important. We talk a lot, there's this whole green building movement. I'm sure you have it here, we have it in the US. It's very important to have buildings that have a light carbon footprint and manufacturing that has a light carbon footprint. But as individuals, as citizens, the way that each of us, at least in the US, the way that each of us contributes principally to our carbon footprint is driving. For most of us, driving constitutes more than half of our personal carbon footprint. So if you can, you said, you know, if you can make people to walk. I don't want to make anyone do anything, but if you can create a physical framework that makes walking more convenient and more desirable, that's the best thing you can do to lighten each individual's footprint in terms of climate change.
Спасибо большое за вопрос. У нас последний вопрос на сегодня.
Thank you so much. And this is the really last question. Okay, then this is a really final question, but there are two questions in one. Jeff, I'd like to thank you for the lecture. It was really very interesting and useful. But everybody who is in charge of the changes in our cities have one question in mind. Are these approaches of the walkable city, bicycle traffic development, is this all applicable to Russia with the consideration of our cold climate? We have winter for many months. How to overcome these restrictions of climate? And the second question, You mentioned that 150 mayors or so gathered and solved their problems with you. Can you tell us in a few words how this was organized and what were the effects these cities gained? Maybe we can do something similar in Russia. Thank you.
Second question is about impacts of the Mayor's Institute. I'm reminding myself. The first question was about climate and bike and cycling. I do think that there is, I do know that climate has an impact on cycling population. What the data, though, from different cities shows us is that it has less impact than other things. So, for example, many more people bike in Alaska than in California because the investment's been made in infrastructure, and the way the cities are organized, biking is more effective there, even though Alaska is, 100 times colder than California. More people bicycle in San Francisco than in Los Angeles. San Francisco is cold and rainy much of the year and has very steep hills. Los Angeles is perfect weather all the time and it's flat. So topography is not as big a factor as the investment the cities have made in cycling. Do I think you're going to have a 12-month biking season? Maybe not. I have great pictures. I'll be showing one to the smaller group tomorrow of people biking in a snowstorm in Copenhagen. And Jan Gale tells the story in Finland about how actually when it snows, the cities plow the bike lanes before they plow the street because that's actually serving more of the population. One cyclist told me, tell me if I need to translate this differently, but one cyclist told me, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad gear. And by gear, we means clothing and other stuff. So yes, weather matters, but it's not the principal determinant of population. In terms of the Mayor's Institute, so each mayor would bring an individual, and when I say, in terms of how it's organized, it's important that I describe a little bit more. I work with 150 mayors personally, because that was over 4 years of institutes, doing an institute, multiple institutes every year. I didn't go to every one, but the Mayor's Institute serves 8 mayors at a time, and it currently, I think, meets every 2 months somewhere. So every 2 months, 8 American mayors are involved in a Mayor's Institute. Important to its success is that it's so few people. And you have 8 mayors and 8 designers around one table in one quiet room. There's one conversation, and it's private, and it's focused, and each mayor has a case study which is discussed. Typical case studies, for example, are how do I reconnect to my waterfront? Or how do I develop this dead part of my downtown? Or my main intersection has a big missing corner where the department store went away, and what can I put there? And so the solutions are no better than the minds in the room, but of course there's a lot of great minds in the room, including the other mayors who may have had similar experiences in their own city. And we have testimony, because every public program like this constantly needs to fight for its funding. In fact, right now you may have been aware that everything good in our government is being eliminated and replaced by something bad, but let's not get into that. But the Mayor's Institute is always fighting for funding, and so we have, if you go to micd.org, Mayor's Institute on City Design, do I have to say it differently? micd.org, there's lots of examples of success stories where the mayors say, wow, I participated in some myself. One that I worked on was Oklahoma City, where it was named, Oklahoma City is a pretty big city in Oklahoma. Geographically, it's one of the biggest cities in America in terms of square kilometers. It was named the least walkable city in America by a popular magazine in the US. And the mayor said, what do we do? And we ended up actually, here was a case where they had a lot of money because they have a lot of oil. Oklahoma City is a center of oil and gas. And so they had about $200 million coming to the city because they were building a big oil company was building a big tower. And that tower was generating new revenue to the city because all these new people were going to be working in the city. So that's more taxes for the city. And the city said, what do we spend that money on? And the mayor, because he'd been to the Institute, said, we're going to redesign and rebuild our entire central business district. Every street, not the buildings, but every street from building to building. And that project is almost complete right now. And according to the reports, I worked on it, so I don't want to brag too much, but according to the reports, you know, there used to be no reason to go downtown in Oklahoma City, and now it's a real attraction that brings a lot of people in and a lot of people choosing to live there as well.
Спасибо большое, Джефф.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and we would like to finish our talk. Thanks a lot for being with us, and now you're invited to the embankment of astronauts for a big city celebration. Thank you, dear friends.
Перевод. И да, мы ждем вас на набережной Космонавтов для просмотра концерта и для праздничного салюта. Спасибо большое.